On the morning of January 25, 1872, Samuel Porter walked 5 miles through snow to check on his neighbor and found Elias Harmon frozen solid in his chair, the stove beside him cold, the ashes barely disturbed, and firewood stacked neatly just outside the door. The cabin had equilibrated to 10 degrees above zero. Elias had died while warmth sat unused within arm's reach, having refused the fire that could have saved him on the coldest night of winter. Welcome to this journey through one of the most stubbornly maintained refusals ever documented in the Ozark Plateau. In the years when winter cold could kill in hours, when fire was not comfort but necessity, and maintaining warmth was the difference between survival and death, when accepting shelter and heat from neighbors was understood to be not just courtesy, but obligation to preserve life that winter would otherwise claim, there lived a man who refused the fire that was offered to him, who insisted on enduring cold that no person could survive without heat, and who demonstrated through his death what happens when pride or principle or some compulsion that no one understood carried a person beyond the limits of what human physiology can endure, leaving his body to be found frozen in a cabin where wood was stacked and kindling was dry and fire could have been lit but was not, where warmth was available but was refused, where survival was possible but was not chosen. Comment where you're watching from as we trace the line between determination and self-destruction, between refusing help and refusing life itself. This video is a work of fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. Before we enter that cold cabin and try to understand what drove a man to refuse the fire that could have saved him, consider what fire meant on the frontier and why its refusal was understood to be not merely unusual but incomprehensible, a rejection of the most fundamental tool that made winter survival possible. Fire was not luxury, it was life. It was the technology that allowed humans to exist in climates that would otherwise kill them within hours. It was the line between inhabitable space and lethal cold, between shelter and exposure, between waking the next morning and freezing to death in darkness. A man who refused fire in winter was refusing survival itself. He was choosing death, whether he understood his choice in those terms or not, because the mathematics of cold were absolute and unforgiving. A human body without external heat source, in temperatures well below freezing, in a space that provided shelter from wind but no warmth, would lose heat faster than it could generate it, would exhaust its energy attempting to maintain core temperature, and would fail within hours. Hypothermia, progressing through stages that could be prevented at any point by the simple act of lighting a fire, but that became irreversible once the body's core temperature dropped below the threshold where voluntary action was possible and where the simple physical act of striking a match or building a fire exceeded the remaining capacity for coordinated movement. Elias Harmon's refusal of fire, his insistence on enduring a January night without heat despite having the materials and the capability to warm himself, despite neighbors offering help and shelter, and the physical act of lighting his stove for him, demonstrated what happens when human will encounters limitations that will does not acknowledge. When stubbornness or principle or psychological compulsion drives someone to test whether determination can substitute for the physical requirements of survival, whether refusing to compromise can overcome the body's absolute need for warmth, and whether death that arrives from choice is different in any meaningful way from death that arrives from circumstance, when the result is the same cold body found in a cold cabin, where warmth was available but was not accepted. Elias Harmon was 56 years old in the winter of 1872, a widower who had lost his wife Margaret to fever 3 years earlier, living alone in a cabin approximately 5 miles north of what would eventually become Branson, Missouri. He had been in the region since 1854, had spent 18 years building a modest but functional homestead, and was known to his neighbors as a capable man who was increasingly reclusive following his wife's death, but who remained generally competent in managing his property and his survival through the seasons that tested every frontier resident's skills and endurance. The winter of 1871-1872 was severe by Ozark standards. Temperatures in December had dropped into the single digits above zero, occasionally falling below zero during the coldest nights. Snow had accumulated to perhaps 18 inches on level ground, and the cold had persisted for weeks without the moderating periods that usually provided relief from extreme temperatures and that allowed people to restock firewood, or to check on neighbors, or to verify that the community was surviving the hardship without crisis. Elias had prepared for winter in the ways that experience had taught him. He had gathered firewood during fall and had stacked it near his cabin for easy access during cold weather. He had stored food adequate for months of isolation. He had repaired his cabin and had ensured that his stove, a cast-iron wood burning unit that had served him for many years, was functional and adequate to heat the small space he lived in. His preparations were sufficient, his supplies were adequate, and there was no obvious reason why he should face any difficulty surviving a winter that was harsh but not unprecedented in the region's experience. But neighbors who saw Elias in early January noticed that something seemed wrong with him, that he appeared more withdrawn than usual, that he spoke in ways that were strange or disconnected from the topics of conversation, and that he showed signs of neglecting basic maintenance of his property and his person that suggested either illness or a psychological state that was affecting his judgment and his capacity to care for himself adequately. Samuel Porter, a neighbor who lived approximately 2 miles east of Elias's cabin, visited on January 8, 1872, bringing some extra supplies and intending to verify that Elias was managing through the severe cold that had persisted for the previous several weeks. Porter found Elias in his cabin, which was cold. Not frozen, but noticeably cold in a way that suggested the fire had not been maintained properly, or had been allowed to burn down to levels that provided minimal heat. Porter commented on the cold and asked why Elias wasn't keeping a better fire going when the weather was so severe and when adequate firewood appeared to be stacked outside the cabin. Elias responded that he didn't need much fire, that he was managing fine with minimal heat, and that he preferred not to burn too much wood because he wanted to conserve his supply. This response seemed reasonable on the surface. Conserving resources was a normal winter concern, and burning only as much wood as necessary was prudent management. But Porter noted that Elias had adequate firewood for the remainder of winter, even with normal consumption, that there was no need to conserve to the point where the cabin was uncomfortably cold, and that the slight savings in wood was not worth the discomfort and the risk of allowing the cabin to get cold enough that maintaining body heat became difficult. Porter offered to help Elias build up his fire before leaving, to bring the cabin to a more comfortable temperature that would be safer and more reasonable for the weather conditions. Elias declined the offer, insisting that he was fine as he was, that he didn't want the cabin too warm, and that Porter should not concern himself with Elias's choices about how to manage his own fire and his own comfort. The refusal was polite but firm, delivered in a tone that suggested Elias was not interested in discussing the matter further, and that he expected his decisions to be respected, regardless of whether neighbors thought they were wise. Porter left troubled by the interaction, but uncertain what he could or should do about it. Elias was an adult, was not obviously incapacitated or unable to care for himself, and had the right to manage his cabin and his fire as he saw fit. If he wanted to keep his cabin colder than was comfortable or normal, that was his choice to make, even if it seemed Unwise, and even if it suggested that something might be wrong with his judgment or his priorities. But over the following days, as the cold intensified, and as temperatures dropped to levels that were dangerous even with adequate fire, other neighbors who saw smoke, or the lack of smoke rising from Elias's chimney, became concerned. Smoke from a chimney in winter indicated that someone was maintaining fire, was staying warm, was alive and functioning. Minimal smoke or no smoke suggested either that someone had run out of fuel or had stopped maintaining their fire for some reason, and either situation was cause for concern when temperatures were severe enough that survival without heat was impossible. On January 12th, 4 days after Porter's visit, another neighbor named John Davidson observed that very little smoke was coming from Elias's chimney, despite temperatures that had fallen below zero overnight and that remained in the single digits during the day. This was alarming. Anyone living in an Ozark cabin during such weather should have been maintaining a substantial fire, should have been burning enough wood to keep the space warm enough to prevent freezing, and the minimal smoke suggested that Elias either had run out of wood or was not maintaining fire at levels adequate for survival. Davidson walked to Elias's cabin that afternoon, arriving to find the structure cold despite the firewood that was still stacked outside and that clearly had not been exhausted. Davidson knocked on the door and called out to Elias, receiving a response that confirmed someone was inside and alive. When Elias opened the door, Davidson felt the cold air that poured out from the interior. The cabin was perhaps only a few degrees warmer than the outside temperature. Far too cold to be safe. Far too cold to indicate that any substantial fire was burning inside. Davidson entered despite Elias's obvious reluctance to allow visitors, and he saw immediately what the problem was. The stove contained barely any fire, a few small pieces of wood burning with flames that provided minimal heat, surrounded by cold metal and cold cabin air that indicated the fire had been kept at this low level for hours or days. The cabin was perhaps 35 degrees inside, maybe 40 degrees, when outside temperatures were in the single digits, and when the cabin should have been 60 or 70 degrees if the stove was being used properly. Davidson confronted Elias about the situation, asking directly why he was allowing the cabin to remain so cold when he had adequate firewood, and when the weather was severe enough that such cold was dangerous. Elias's response was similar to what he had told Porter, that he didn't need much fire, that he was fine as he was, that he preferred the cabin not be too warm. But Davidson noticed that Elias was showing signs of being affected by the cold. His speech was slightly slow, his movements were deliberate in ways that suggested physical effort, and his skin showed the pale, waxy appearance that indicated someone who had been cold for extended periods. Davidson told Elias directly that he was going to build up the fire, that the current situation was not safe, and that he would not leave until the cabin was warm enough to ensure Elias's survival through the night. He added wood to the stove, substantial pieces that would burn for hours, and he adjusted the draft to ensure adequate oxygen for combustion. He stayed while the stove heated, while the cabin's temperature began to rise toward reasonable levels, and while Elias sat quietly, neither helping nor hindering, but also not showing the relief or gratitude that would be expected from someone who had just been rescued from dangerous cold. Before leaving, Davidson spoke with Elias seriously about the importance of maintaining proper fire through the remainder of winter, about the fact that temperatures as low as they had been would kill him if he continued to keep the cabin at the minimal levels he had been maintaining, and about the need to accept that fire in winter was not optional but necessary for survival. Elias listened without responding substantially, acknowledged that he understood what Davidson was saying, but gave no indication that he intended to change his behavior or that he recognized the situation as dangerous, rather than merely uncomfortable. Davidson left with deep concern, knowing that he had provided temporary warmth, but that he could not force Elias to maintain fire once Davidson was gone. That adult men had the right to make their own choices even when those choices were self-destructive, and that the only thing neighbors could do was check on Elias frequently and hope that he would maintain adequate fire or would accept help before the cold killed him. Over the following week, several neighbors made it a point to check on Elias regularly, to verify that smoke was rising from his chimney, and to intervene if it appeared that he was again allowing his fire to burn too low. These checks revealed a pattern. Elias would maintain adequate fire for a day or two following a visit from neighbors, but then he would allow the fire to diminish again, returning to the minimal heat that seemed to be his preference, despite the danger it created and despite the repeated interventions and warnings from people who understood that such behavior in temperatures below zero was not eccentric preference, but suicidal neglect. Samuel Porter visited again on January 18th and found the cabin cold once more, found Elias sitting in his chair wearing multiple layers of clothing, but showing signs of hypothermia, confusion, slowed speech, lack of concern about his condition. Porter again built up the fire, again warned Elias about the danger, and again left knowing that the intervention was temporary and that Elias would likely allow the fire to diminish as soon as Porter was out of sight. Porter considered whether Elias should be forcibly removed from his cabin, whether the community should intervene more aggressively to prevent what was beginning to look like a slow suicide by cold. But the legal and moral complexities of forcing an adult to accept help he refused made such action difficult to justify or implement. The weather through late January remained brutally cold. Temperatures consistently fell below zero at night and rarely rose above 10 degrees during the day. These were conditions where maintaining substantial fire was not just advisable, but absolutely necessary, where allowing a cabin to cool to near freezing was dangerous, and where spending a full night without adequate heat would be fatal for anyone who was not actively generating warmth through vigorous physical activity, which sleeping does not provide. On January 23rd, Davidson checked on Elias's cabin and noted that very little smoke was visible from the chimney despite the extreme cold. This was now the third or fourth time in 2 weeks that neighbors had found Elias maintaining inadequate fire, and Davidson made the decision that more aggressive intervention was necessary. He walked to the cabin and knocked, calling out to Elias and preparing to force entry if no response came. Elias opened the door, and Davidson entered to find conditions similar to previous visits. Minimal fire, cold cabin, Elias showing signs of cold stress, but insisting that he was fine and did not need help. Davidson told Elias plainly that he could not be allowed to continue this pattern, that if he would not maintain adequate fire, then he needed to accept shelter at a neighbor's home, where the fire would be maintained properly and where he would not be at risk of freezing to death. Elias refused both options. He would not promise to maintain better fire, and he would not accept shelter elsewhere. He wanted to remain in his own cabin, wanted to manage his own fire as he saw fit, and wanted neighbors to stop interfering with his choices, even if those choices seemed unwise to outside observers. Davidson attempted to reason with Elias, explaining the medical reality of hypothermia, describing how the body loses heat faster than it can generate it in cold conditions, explaining that the confusion and the lack of concern that Elias was displaying were themselves symptoms of cold, affecting his brain and his judgment. But Elias dismissed these explanations, insisting that he knew what he was doing, that he had survived previous winters without incident, and that the current situation was his business alone. Frustrated but recognizing that he could not legally or practically force Elias to accept help, he refused Davidson left after rebuilding the fire and after extracting a promise from Elias that he would maintain it through the night. But Davidson had little confidence that the promise would be kept. Had seen too many times already that Elias's pattern was to allow the fire to diminish regardless of visits or warnings or help that was provided, and had the growing sense that Elias was not just being stubborn, but was actively seeking something. Whether it was proving he could endure without normal comfort, testing his own limits, or pursuing some darker goal that he had not articulated and that neighbors could only guess at. What Samuel Porter understood, lying awake in his own warm cabin on the night of January 24th, was that all the interventions and all the warnings had failed to change the fundamental pattern. 4 visits in 2 weeks. 4 times the fire had been rebuilt. 4 times Elias had promised or implied he would maintain proper heat. And 4 times he had returned to his minimal fire within days or hours of neighbors leaving. Porter had tried reasoning. Davidson had tried confrontation. Both had tried simply doing the work for Elias, building up the fire, ensuring warmth, hoping that experiencing proper heat would remind Elias of what he was refusing. Nothing had worked. The pattern persisted with the inevitability of something that was no longer within Elias's conscious control, or that served some purpose that Elias valued more than his own survival. The minister, Reverend Thomas Morgan, had been kept informed of the situation by the neighbors who were attempting to help Elias. Morgan had considered visiting himself, had considered whether religious counsel might reach Elias in ways that practical warnings had not. But Morgan also understood that Elias had not attended church since his wife's death 3 years earlier, that whatever crisis Elias was experiencing was not one that seemed to respond to external intervention, and that forcing religious comfort on someone who had not sought it might do more harm than good. What troubled Morgan most was the theological question that Elias's situation raised. If a man chose death, not through violence, but through passive refusal of life's requirements, was that suicide? And if it was suicide, how should the community and the church respond to someone whose method of self-destruction was simply to refuse the basic necessities that winter required? The traditional understanding of suicide involved active self-harm, a violent choice that was clearly distinct from natural death. But what Elias was doing, refusing fire while cold killed him incrementally, was neither clearly active nor clearly passive, neither obviously suicidal nor obviously accidental. Morgan had no clear answers. He could only hope that whatever happened in the coming days, the community's response would be guided by compassion rather than by judgment, by understanding that human behavior in grief and isolation could take forms that defied simple categorization, and by recognition that Elias's death, if it came, would be tragedy regardless of whether it was technically classified as suicide or accident. January 24th brought the coldest night of the winter. Temperatures fell to 15 below zero by the early morning hours, creating conditions where even well-heated cabins struggled to maintain comfortable temperature, and where any structure without substantial fire would drop to lethal cold within hours. The extreme temperature was noted by everyone in the community, was the kind of cold that made people check their fires multiple times during the night, that made them burn more wood than usual, that made them grateful for sturdy cabins and adequate fuel and the simple blessing of warmth that stood between them and the deadly cold that surrounded their shelters. Samuel Porter, lying awake during the coldest hours of that night and listening to the wind that made the extreme temperature even more dangerous, thought about Elias in his cabin 5 miles away, and worried that this night, with cold more severe than any night so far this winter, might be the night when Elias's refusal of adequate fire would prove fatal. Porter considered attempting to reach Elias's cabin during the night to verify that fire was being maintained, But the extreme cold and the darkness and the distance made such a journey dangerous, and Porter convinced himself that surely Elias would recognize that this night required proper fire, that even someone as stubbornly resistant to maintaining heat as Elias had been would understand that 15 below zero was not weather that could be endured without substantial warmth. But even as Porter tried to convince himself, he knew that Elias's pattern over the previous weeks suggested that extreme cold might not change his behavior, that if anything, Elias seemed to become more resistant to maintaining fire as the cold worsened rather than more careful about ensuring adequate heat, as if he was testing himself or proving something that only he understood and that he had not explained to anyone who tried to help him. Morning came, with temperatures still below zero. Porter waited until dawn provided enough light to travel safely, then walked the 5 miles to Elias's cabin, arriving around 7 o'clock to find no smoke rising from the chimney. The absence of smoke in temperatures that were still 5 below zero was an emergency. It meant either that Elias had run out of wood, which was unlikely given the visible supply outside his cabin, or that he had stopped maintaining fire, which was fatal in such cold unless intervention came quickly. Porter ran the final distance to the cabin, calling out to Elias as he approached, hoping for a response that would indicate life, but hearing only silence. He reached the door and found it unlatched, not unusual for Elias, who often did not bother with locks, and pushed it open to enter the cabin and find what he had feared he would find. Elias was dead. His body was seated in his chair near the cold stove, wearing the multiple layers of clothing that he had been wearing during previous visits, positioned as if he had simply sat down and never gotten up again. The cabin was bitterly cold, perhaps 10 degrees above zero inside, having equilibrated to near outside temperature over the hours since whatever fire had been burning had gone out. The stove was cold, contained only ashes and a few pieces of partially burned wood that had gone out hours earlier, and showed no evidence that substantial fire had been maintained during the night. Porter touched Elias's face and found it frozen solid. The body was rigid with the cold. The skin was white and hard, and there was no question that death had occurred many hours earlier, probably during the night when temperatures had been at their coldest. Elias had frozen to death in his cabin while sitting in his chair, while firewood was stacked outside his door, while the stove, that could have saved him, sat cold beside him, containing fuel that was adequate to heat the cabin, but that had not been added or had not been maintained in sufficient quantity to provide the warmth that survival required. Porter searched the cabin for any explanation, for any note or any sign that would indicate whether Elias's death had been intentional suicide or whether it had been the result of confusion or inability to maintain fire due to hypothermia affecting his judgment and his motor skills. But there was no note, no indication of specific intent, nothing beyond the pattern that neighbors had observed over the previous weeks. A man who consistently refused to maintain adequate fire, who resisted help when it was offered, who insisted that he was fine when he clearly was not, and who had finally experienced the inevitable consequence of refusing warmth in temperatures that would not forgive such refusal. The community's response to Elias's death was complicated by the question of whether it should be understood as accident, as suicide, or as something in between, a self-destruction that was perhaps not consciously intended, but that was the predictable result of behavior that Elias had maintained despite repeated warnings and interventions. The minister, Reverend Thomas Morgan, struggled with how to address the death in his service, whether to speak about it as tragedy or as avoidable waste, whether to emphasize the mental confusion that hypothermia creates or the stubborn refusal to accept help that had characterized Elias's final weeks. The autopsy, conducted by the nearest doctor who traveled from a settlement 20 miles distant, confirmed that Elias had died of hypothermia, that his body had cooled to the point where cardiac function had failed, and that death had probably occurred in the early morning hours when temperatures had been at their coldest, and when any remaining fire in the stove had gone out completely. The doctor noted that Elias showed signs of chronic cold exposure, that his body appeared to have been subjected to temperatures below what was safe for extended periods leading up to his death, and that the final fatal night was likely just the culmination of weeks during which Elias had been maintaining inadequate warmth and subjecting himself to cold that was gradually compromising his health and his judgment. But the doctor could not determine why Elias had behaved this way, why he had refused to maintain adequate fire, why he had rejected help from neighbors who tried to assist him, or whether his refusal was the result of depression following his wife's death 3 years earlier, or some form of psychological deterioration that affected his judgment, or a deliberate decision to end his life through passive means that would appear accidental. The body provided evidence of how Elias had died, but not why he had chosen, if choice was the right word, to die in this particular way. Neighbors who had tried to help Elias in his final weeks carried guilt and frustration in varying proportions. Samuel Porter questioned whether he should have been more insistent, whether he should have physically removed Elias from his cabin against his will, whether respecting Elias's autonomy had been the right choice when the result of that respect had been Elias's death. John Davidson wondered whether there had been some combination of words or actions that would have convinced Elias to accept help, whether the multiple interventions had been insufficient or had been conducted in ways that pushed Elias further into resistance, rather than toward acceptance of the warmth he needed. But others in the community, including Reverend Morgan, suggested that Elias's death was not the result of neighbors failing to help, but rather the result of Elias refusing help that had been offered repeatedly and persistently, that adults had the right to make their own choices even when those choices led to harm, and that the community had done what it could short of forcing Elias to accept protection he did not want. The guilt that some neighbors felt was perhaps misplaced, arising from the natural human desire to have prevented a death that seemed avoidable. But the reality was that Elias had been determined to maintain his pattern of minimal fire, and that no amount of intervention had changed that determination. Elias's cabin was examined after his death to see if it contained any clues about his state of mind or his reasons for refusing fire. The cabin was sparse, containing little beyond basic furniture and supplies, showing signs of neglect that suggested Elias had not been maintaining his property or his living conditions with the care that frontier survival typically required. Papers found in the cabin included letters from his children. He had 3 adult children living in other settlements, expressing concern about his welfare and encouraging him to come live with them, or at least to accept help from neighbors. But Elias had not responded to these letters, had not accepted the offers they contained, and had apparently made the decision to remain alone in his cabin, managing his life as he saw fit, regardless of concerns expressed by family or neighbors. One letter, written by Elias himself but never sent, suggested some of what he might have been thinking. The letter was addressed to his deceased wife, Margaret, and spoke about his loneliness, about his difficulty finding purpose after her death, and about his sense that the world had become cold in ways that had nothing to do with weather. The letter did not explicitly state that he intended to die, did not contain any clear suicide note content, but it expressed a weariness and a detachment that suggested someone who was no longer fully engaged with life and who might not be actively resisting death if it came. But whether this letter represented a suicidal mindset or merely normal grief and loneliness was unclear. Many widows and widowers experienced similar feelings without choosing to die, without refusing the basic necessities of survival, without creating conditions where death became inevitable. The letter provided context for Elias's state of mind, but did not definitively explain why he had refused fire, or whether that refusal was conscious choice, or was the result of impaired judgment that hypothermia itself had created. The question of whether Elias's death was suicide remained unresolved. Legally and for the purposes of burial, it was recorded as accidental death by exposure, caused by inadequate fire maintenance during extreme cold. But within the community, opinions varied about whether this classification was accurate, or whether it obscured a more complicated reality in which Elias had not actively killed himself, but had passively allowed death to arrive by refusing the measures that would have prevented it. The distinction mattered for how people understood Elias's death and what lessons they drew from it. If his death was accident, the result of confusion or inability to maintain fire due to hypothermia affecting his brain, then the lesson was about the importance of checking on neighbors frequently and about the dangers of allowing anyone to remain isolated during extreme weather. If his death was suicide, the result of deliberate choice to refuse life-preserving warmth, then the lesson was darker and more difficult, about the limits of what community could do to prevent someone from choosing death, about the ways that depression or grief could manifest as passive surrender rather than active harm, and about the reality that help offered could always be help refused, and that such refusal could not always be prevented, even when the consequences were fatal. Elias Harmon was buried in the small cemetery that served the Cedar Creek community, his grave marked with a simple stone that gave his name and his dates, but that contained no epitaph to explain how he had died or why. His death was remembered by those who had known him as a warning and as a mystery. A warning about the importance of maintaining fire in winter and about the speed with which cold could kill once adequate warmth was refused, and a mystery about what had driven a capable man to refuse the fire that could have saved him, to insist on enduring cold that was designed to kill, and to sit in his chair on the coldest night of the winter, while warmth was available but unused, and while his body gradually cooled to the temperature of the air around him until cardiac function failed, and death arrived not as violence or as sudden crisis, but as the quiet cessation of a metabolism that had exhausted its capacity to generate heat in an environment that took heat faster than human physiology could replace it. In the years following Elias's death, the story of the man who refused the fire became a cautionary tale told in the region, a reminder about the dangers of stubbornness or depression or whatever force had driven Elias to maintain behavior that everyone around him recognized as fatal, but that he insisted on continuing. The story was told to emphasize the importance of accepting help when it was offered, of recognizing that pride or principle or autonomy were not worth dying for, and of understanding that winter did not care about human will or determination or refusal. It simply took heat from bodies until those bodies could no longer function, and the only defense was fire. And fire refused was life refused, and life refused was death accepted, whether the person refusing understood their choice in those terms or not. The cabin where Elias died remained standing for several years, but was never reoccupied. People in the community felt uncomfortable about the idea of living in the place where someone had frozen to death, while firewood sat unused outside, where the stove had sat cold while the man beside it died, where refusal had been maintained until it became irreversible. The cabin gradually deteriorated, its roof collapsing by the late 1870s, its walls falling by the 1880s, and by the 1890s it had returned to the land, marked only by a depression where the foundation had been, and by the knowledge that a man had once lived there and had chosen, or had failed to choose, to maintain the fire that survival required. Modern understanding of hypothermia provides some insight into what Elias might have experienced during his final weeks and his final night. Hypothermia affects judgment and decision-making before it causes unconsciousness or death, creating a situation where someone whose body temperature has dropped even moderately below normal may make decisions that seem rational to them, but that are objectively dangerous or irrational. A person in early hypothermia might decide that they don't need more clothing or more heat, might feel warm when they are actually cold, might resist help because they genuinely do not perceive the danger they are in. This suggests that Elias's refusal of fire might not have been conscious suicidal choice, but rather the result of hypothermia, creating a feedback loop where inadequate heat caused confusion, that led to maintaining inadequate heat that caused further confusion in a cycle that continued until death resulted. If this interpretation is correct, then Elias's death was not suicide, but rather a tragic demonstration of how hypothermia can kill not just through freezing, but through creating the mental states that prevent people from taking actions that would save them. But this interpretation does not fully explain why Elias allowed himself to reach hypothermic states initially, why he maintained minimal fire during the early visits when neighbors found his cabin cold, but when he was not yet showing obvious signs of impaired judgment, or why he resisted help so consistently that it suggests something more than mere underestimation of danger. Some element of choice appears to have been involved in the initial pattern, even if later behavior was influenced by the physiological effects of cold on brain function. The question of what drove Elias to refuse fire, whether his death was chosen or was the result of impaired judgment, and whether neighbors could have done more to prevent it, remains unresolvable at the distance of more than 150 years. What can be documented is that Elias Harmon died of hypothermia on the night of January 24, 1872, in his cabin during temperatures of 15 below zero, while firewood was available and while the stove beside him was cold, having refused the fire that multiple neighbors had offered and having maintained a pattern of inadequate warmth despite repeated warnings that such behavior in extreme cold was fatal. His death demonstrated that human will, whether exercised as stubborn refusal or as impaired judgment caused by cold itself, could not substitute for the physical requirements of survival. That determination could not replace heat, and that when a man refused fire in winter, the result was not proving anything except that cold would take life from anyone who did not actively resist it through the simple act of maintaining flame. We have reached the end of this journey through one of the Ozark Plateau's most stubbornly maintained refusals. A man who would not keep his fire burning, who rejected help from neighbors who tried to save him, and who died in cold that could have been prevented by the simple act of adding wood to a stove that sat beside him unused while his body temperature dropped and his metabolism failed, and death arrived as the inevitable consequence of refusing the warmth that winter demanded as the price of survival. A man named Elias refused the fire, and he did not survive the night. Stands as a reminder that some refusals are refusals of life itself, that stubbornness or depression or impaired judgment can create situations where the difference between survival and death is measured in the simple act of maintaining flame, and that winter extends no mercy to those who refuse its terms. It simply takes what it takes, removes heat from bodies that do not actively replace it, and leaves behind cold corpses in cold rooms where warmth was available but was not used, where help was offered but was not accepted, where survival was possible but was not chosen. If you've made it this far on this journey through territory, where refusal becomes death, and where cold claims those who will not resist it, consider subscribing to Commute Tales for more stories that explore the boundaries between choice and compulsion, between stubbornness and self-destruction. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on whether Elias's death was suicide or accident. on whether neighbors should have intervened more forcefully, on what drives someone to refuse the help that would save them. And if this story resonated with you, if it made you think about the help we refuse and the consequences of that refusal, alike helps bring these narratives to more people who appreciate stories that remind us that survival requires accepting the terms that nature sets, that winter does not negotiate with our pride or our principles, and that refusing fire when fire is necessary is refusing life itself. Until our next journey into territories where refusal persists, until it becomes irreversible, remember that somewhere in the Ozark Plateau, a man once sat in his chair on the coldest night of winter, while the stove beside him went cold, while firewood waited outside his door, and while all that was required for survival was the simple act that was refused, maintaining flame, accepting heat, choosing life over the cold that takes what cold always takes when not actively resisted.